It was a cold evening when the building slowly grew silent. The long hallways of the headquarters stood still, and the sound of footsteps faded one by one. Elder Oaks had just finished a long day of meetings when a soft message came through. President Nelson wants to see you in his study. Without a word, he put away his papers and walked upstairs. Something in his heart told him this meeting would be different. When Elder Oaks entered, the room was dimly lit. A single lamp on the desk glowed warmly, and President Nelson was sitting beside it, wrapped in a gray blanket over his shoulders. His face looked calm but weaker than before, his eyes full of thought and peace. He smiled faintly and motioned for Elder Oaks to sit beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the ticking clock filled the air. Finally, President Nelson broke the silence. "My dear friend," he said softly, "we've walked a long road together, haven't we?" His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of memory. Elder Oaks nodded quietly, his heart heavy. Nelson continued, "There comes a time when words matter more than plans, when what we leave behind isn't written on paper, but in people." He leaned forward slowly, placing his frail hand on Oak's arm. "I want you to remember 3 things," he said. "First, always choose unity over pride. You'll meet many who want to divide, but remember, unity builds, pride destroys." He paused to catch his breath, then continued, "Second, lead with compassion. People may forget your words, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And third," he smiled softly, "be brave enough to stand alone if truth demands it. Courage isn't about fighting. It's about standing quietly when others walk away." The room fell silent again. Elder Oaks looked at him with deep respect, realizing these were not just lessons. These were President Nelson's final instructions, his farewell message to the one who would carry the mission forward. Nelson's eyes closed for a brief moment as if in prayer. When he opened them again, his gaze was peaceful. "I trust you, my brother," he whispered. "The work must continue, and you will do it well." Elder Oaks didn't know what to say. His throat tightened, and all he could manage was a quiet, "Thank you, President." Nelson smiled again, almost as if he was already at peace. "Don't thank me," he said softly. "Thank the Lord who allowed us to serve together." Moments later, as Elder Oaks left the room, he turned one last time to see President Nelson still sitting there, still, calm, and thoughtful, the lamp's light reflecting gently on his face. It was an image that would stay with him forever. That night, Elder Oaks couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk and opened his personal journal. With steady hands, he wrote down every word Nelson had said. Unity, compassion, courage. 3 simple words that now felt like sacred promises. The next morning, as sunlight entered his room, he whispered to himself, "He passed the light to me. Now it's my turn to keep it burning." And from that day on, every decision Elder Oaks made carried the quiet wisdom of that final meeting in the upper room. A moment that changed not only his path but the heart of the entire faith he served. The rain had been falling since morning, soft and steady, tapping gently against the windows of President Nelson's office. He sat at his old wooden desk, a quiet look in his eyes. The room smelled faintly of paint. On the front, he wrote in neat letters, "For Elder Dallin H. Oaks, personal." Then he set it inside his desk drawer. He looked at it one last time before whispering, "He'll know what it means." Days passed. President Nelson never mentioned the letter again. He grew weaker, his health fading quietly, but his spirit remained calm and strong until the very end. And when he finally passed, the office was left untouched, still carrying the peaceful silence he had left behind. A week later, Elder Oaks was in that same room. The air felt heavy with memories. As he opened the desk drawer to gather Nelson's old notes, his eyes fell on the sealed envelope. His hands froze. The handwriting was unmistakable. He slowly picked it up, holding it as if it were made of glass. When he opened it and began to read, his eyes filled with tears. Every word carried Nelson's voice, gentle and full of warmth. But when he reached the line, "Remember the mountain," he stopped. His heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly what it meant. Many years ago, the two men had climbed a small mountain during a leadership retreat. The weather had been harsh, the path difficult, and at one point Nelson had said, "Climbing is never easy, but the view at the top reminds you why you kept going." It was a moment Oakes had never forgotten. Now, sitting alone with that letter, those words came back with new meaning. Remember, the mountain wasn't about the climb itself. It was about endurance, about never losing hope, no matter how steep the path became. Elder Oakes folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his own journal. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I'll remember, President, I promise." From that day onward, whenever challenges came, whenever decisions weighed heavy on his heart, he would pause for a moment and look toward the nearest mountain, silent and tall. And each time, he felt the same quiet voice in his heart, the voice of his old friend, reminding him to keep climbing, to stay humble, and to never give up. It was still dark outside when Elder Oakes woke up suddenly. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost sacred. For a moment, he didn't know what had woken him. The clock on his bedside table showed 4:12 a.m. He sat up slowly, feeling a strange calm in his chest, as if someone had been near him, whispering softly. He rubbed his eyes and looked toward the window. The first faint line of dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon. Then, without warning, the air in the room seemed to change, lighter, peaceful, and almost glowing. And there, sitting by the window in a simple chair, was President Nelson. Elder Oakes froze, unable to move or speak. Nelson looked different, younger, brighter, almost shining in the dim light. He was dressed in white, his face calm, his eyes full of kindness. There was no fear in the room, only deep peace. Nelson smiled gently and said, "You're awake early, my friend." Elder Oakes whispered, "President, is that you?" Nelson nodded, still smiling. "Yes, but not as you last saw me." For a moment neither spoke. The world outside was still, as if time itself had stopped. Then Nelson said, "I came because there's one more thing you must know. The work is not over. It's only begun." His voice was steady, clear, and full of life. Oakes felt his throat tighten. "I don't know if I can do this without you," he said quietly. Nelson shook his head. "You never did it with me," he replied. "You did it with him. That's the secret we often forget." He smiled again, looking toward the window. "You'll have hard days, but remember, every sunrise is proof that darkness doesn't last." The light outside began to grow stronger. Nelson stood slowly, and for a moment, it seemed like the room itself glowed with soft gold. He placed a hand on Oak's shoulder and said, "Be strong, my friend. Lead with love, not fear. Speak to hearts, not to crowds. And when you feel alone, know that you are never truly alone." Elder Oakes wanted to say more, to ask questions, but before he could, the room grew brighter, and suddenly, Nelson was gone. The chair was empty again. The air was still. Oakes sat there, his hands trembling, unsure if he had dreamed it all. But the peace he felt was real, deep, and unshakable. He whispered to himself, "The work is not over. It's only begun." Just then, his phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. It was a message from headquarters. The words made his heart stop for a moment. "President Nelson passed away early this morning." Oakes sat back, tears filling his eyes. He looked again toward the window. The sun was rising, warm, golden, full of life. It felt like a sign, a quiet message from above. That same week, Elder Oakes stood before the congregation to give his first address. His hands were steady, his heart full. When he began to speak, the first words that came out were simple and powerful. "The work is not over. It's only begun." Everyone felt something special in that moment that words alone couldn't explain. And as he spoke, Elder Oakes knew that President Nelson's presence would never truly leave. It would live on, in the work, in the faith, and in the light of every new dawn that followed. The office felt unusually quiet that afternoon. Dust floated in the soft sunlight coming through the tall windows. Elder Oaks sat at President Nelson's old desk, gently touching the wooden surface as memories filled his mind. It had only been a few days since Nelson's passing, yet his presence still lingered. In the books, the papers, and even the faint smell of his favorite cologne. Every corner of the room carried his calm spirit. Elder Oaks had come only to organize Nelson's personal things, to prepare them for the archives. But as he opened the bottom drawer, he noticed a small black device tucked beneath a pile of handwritten notes. It was an old voice recorder. On it, a small white label read, "For Elder Oaks." His heart began to beat faster. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to press play. But something inside him whispered, "You were meant to find this." He slowly placed the recorder on the desk and pressed the button. At first, there was a soft static sound. And then President Nelson's voice filled the room, calm, steady, and warm. "My dear friend," the voice said, "if you are hearing this, then my time on this side of life has ended and yours continues. But there are a few things I want to leave with you, things I could not say face to face." Oaks leaned forward, eyes fixed on the recorder. He could almost see Nelson sitting there again, speaking with that same gentle authority. The voice continued, "We've both learned that leadership isn't about being followed. It's about lifting others. You will face days when the weight feels unbearable. In those moments, don't look for strength in your position, look for it in your purpose." A short pause followed. Oaks could hear Nelson take a slow breath before speaking again. "I've made mistakes," he admitted softly, "but I've learned that forgiveness, both from others and from yourself, is the path to peace. Never be afraid to admit when you're wrong, and never hesitate to lift someone who has fallen. Kindness builds bridges no speech ever can." The voice grew weaker, gentler, but full of emotion. "When I first met you, I knew the Lord had chosen you for something greater. I saw your courage, your honesty, your quiet strength. You will do great things, Dallin, not because of who you are, but because of who you serve." There was a long silence. Oaks thought the recording had ended, but then he heard one final line, a soft whisper that sounded almost like a prayer. "Now it's your turn." The recorder clicked off. The room went completely silent again. Elder Oaks sat still for a long time, his eyes wet with tears. Those words, "Now it's your turn," echoed deep inside him. He reached out, touched the recorder gently, and whispered, "I'll do my best, President. I promise." That evening, he placed the recorder on his bookshelf, right beside his Bible. He didn't tell anyone about it. It was too personal, too sacred. But from that day forward, whenever he felt uncertain or tired, he would close his eyes and hear Nelson's voice again, calm, patient, and full of light. And though the world would never know about that small recording, Elder Oaks carried it in his heart for the rest of his life. It wasn't just a message. It was a final lesson, a reminder that true leadership doesn't end when a man is gone. It lives on, quietly, in the voices that guide us, even after the world has fallen silent. The morning air was cool, and the sky was painted with shades of soft gray and gold. It was early, too early for most to be awake, but President Nelson had always loved the quiet hours of dawn. That day, he had asked Elder Oaks to meet him for a short walk around the temple grounds. There was something peaceful about the idea, though neither of them said much at first. As they walked side by side, the sound of their footsteps mixed with the gentle rustling of leaves. The garden around them was calm, the flowers still covered in dew. For a while, they simply enjoyed the silence. There was no rush, no plan, just two old friends, walking slowly, feeling the weight of years and memories between them. After a few minutes, President Nelson broke the silence. His voice was softer than usual, a little tired but full of warmth. "Do you remember the first time we walked here together?" he asked. Elder Oaks smiled faintly. "Yes, I do. It feels like a lifetime ago." Nelson nodded. "It does. And yet, the mission hasn't changed. Only we have." He paused, stopping near an old oak tree. Its branches stretched wide, strong and steady, though the leaves were starting to turn. Nelson placed his hand gently on the rough bark and said, "Even the strongest trees bend before the storm, but they never break." Elder Oaks stood beside him, listening quietly. These words carried more meaning than they seemed. Nelson looked at the tree for a long moment before turning back to him. "You'll face storms, Dallin. Some you can see, and some you can't. But remember, faith is what keeps the roots strong. Don't fight the storm. Just hold your ground and let the wind pass." There was a pause. A bird landed on one of the branches, chirping softly. Nelson smiled. "I always found comfort here," he said. "When I was unsure, I came to this tree. It reminded me that time passes, seasons change, but purpose remains." Elder Oaks could feel the emotion behind every word. It was as if Nelson knew this would be their last walk together. The thought filled him with sadness, but also deep gratitude. They continued walking slowly, talking about simple things, memories, people they had helped, moments that had shaped their faith. When they finally reached the end of the path, Nelson stopped and turned to him. His eyes were calm, filled with a quiet strength. "You've been a true brother to me," he said. "When I'm gone, promise me one thing. Keep walking. Don't let the work stop here." Elder Oaks felt a lump in his throat. "I promise," he said softly. Nelson nodded with a faint smile. "Good, then I can rest easy." That was the last time they walked together. Days later, when the news came of President Nelson's passing, Elder Oaks returned alone to the same path. The morning looked exactly the same, calm, peaceful, touched with golden light. He walked slowly until he reached the old oak tree. For a moment, he stood there silently, placing his hand where Nelson's had been. "Even the strongest trees bend before the storm," he whispered, "but they never break." Then, with quiet determination, he knelt down and planted a small seed beside the great tree, a symbol of continuation, of faith that endures beyond one lifetime. And as the wind moved gently through the leaves, he felt as if Nelson's presence was still there, steady, kind, and unshaken. From that day on, Elder Oaks visited that tree often. Each time, he found new strength in its shade and new courage in its roots. It reminded him of his friend, his mentor, and the promise he made to keep walking no matter how strong the storm became. It had been a few months since President Nelson's passing. The world had mourned, tributes had been shared, and Elder Oaks had quietly stepped into a new season of leadership. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all pressed heavily on his shoulders. Nelson's words, his presence, his calm wisdom, they were missed by everyone. One morning, while preparing for a major gathering, Elder Oaks was reviewing the event's schedule. It was a day dedicated to honoring the late President Nelson, a memorial broadcast where people from all over the world would tune in to hear stories, teachings, and memories. The team had collected old speeches, photos, and voice recordings from Nelson's years of service. It was meant to be a peaceful remembrance, nothing more. But as the program began that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Halfway through the event, the screen in the main hall flickered. The audio cut off for a moment, replaced by a gentle humming noise. Technicians rushed to fix it, but before they could, a familiar voice filled the hall. Calm, strong, unmistakable. It was President Nelson. The room fell silent instantly. His voice, recorded years earlier, spoke clearly through the speakers. "If you are hearing this, I am no longer among you. But I want to speak not as a leader, not as a name, but as a brother in faith. Remember, our mission was never about power. It was about people, about love, about lifting those who have fallen." No one moved. Some people gasped softly. Others bowed their heads. Elder Oaks stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the screen, his heart pounding. He had never heard this message before. Nelson's voice continued. "I have seen how easy it is to be respected, but how hard it is to be kind. Choose kindness. It will outlast your name. For a moment, the hall was filled with nothing but the sound of his voice. Then, as suddenly as it began, the recording ended. A few seconds of silence passed before the crowd realized what had just happened. The technicians looked confused. One of them approached Elder Oaks and whispered, "Sir, this wasn't in the program. We don't even have that file in the system." Elder Oaks didn't answer. He simply smiled faintly and said, "Leave it. It was meant to be heard." The rest of the event continued quietly. People spoke softer, their words slower, as if they were carrying something sacred in their hearts. No one could explain how that recording had played, or where it came from, but it didn't matter. To everyone in that room, it felt like President Nelson had spoken to them one last time, right when they needed it most. Later that evening, Elder Oaks sat alone in his office, the sound of that message still echoing.